The moment Caroline Levitt stepped into the hearing room, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't just another panel, another round of rehearsed outrage and pre-written talking points. Everyone in the room felt it, even if they pretended not to. Cameras were already locked in. Staffers leaned forward, and at the center of the long days sat Chuck Schumer, calm on the surface, confident in the ease that decades in Washington usually bring. Schumer had done this thousands of times. He knew how to slow things down, redirect, answer questions without actually answering them. He smiled, nodded, adjusted his glasses. This was his terrain, but Caroline didn't come to play on his terms. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. Instead, she paused just long enough for the room to quiet. That pause did more than any gavel ever could. It told everyone watching that something different was coming. This isn't about rhetoric, she said evenly. And it's not about slogans. She glanced down at her notes, then back up at Schumer. It's about decisions. Yours. A few aides shifted in their seats. Schumer offered a thin smile, the kind meant to signal patience. He'd seen challengers come and go. Most flamed out in minutes. Caroline continued anyway. For weeks, she said. You've gone on television claiming you had no idea how bad things would get. No idea how these policies would be used. No idea what the downstream consequences would look like. She let that sit for a beat. And today, she added, you're going to explain how that's possible. Schumer leaned toward his microphone, ready to interrupt, ready to frame the discussion his way. But Caroline didn't stop. She raised a single document, not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough for the cameras to catch it. This, she said, is your vote. Another page followed. This is your public statement afterward. Then another. And this is your defense of it when the first warning signs appeared. The room grew quieter with each sentence. Not tense, but focused. Schumer tried to interject. I think it's important we look at the broader. Caroline cut in, sharp but controlled. Senator, I'm not finished. That line alone sent a ripple through the audience. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't emotional. She was precise, and that was far more dangerous. You don't get to act surprised by outcomes you were warned about, she continued. You don't get to pretend confusion when the record shows clarity. Schumer's expression tightened just slightly. The smile faded, replaced by calculation. He glanced down at his own papers, then back up at her, realizing too late that this wasn't an ambush. It was a setup he'd already walked into. Caroline leaned forward. So before you explain this away, she said, I want a simple answer. Not a speech. Not a pivot. Just an answer. The cameras zoomed in. And here's the question you've been avoiding. Caroline didn't repeat the question immediately. She waited. The silence stretched longer than most people were comfortable with. It forced every camera in the room to stay exactly where it was, locked on Chuck Schumer. He shifted slightly in his chair, fingers tapping once against the desk before he caught himself. This wasn't the rhythm he liked. He preferred momentum, long answers, a blur of words that drowned out specifics. Caroline knew that, and she refused to give him the escape. Senator, she said again, calm but firm. The record is clear, so I'll ask it plainly. She finally looked down at the page in front of her, then back up. When experts warned on the record that this policy would be abused, ignored, and expanded beyond what you promised, did you read those warnings, or did you choose to ignore them? A murmur ran through the room, not loud, just enough to signal that everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't a gotcha. It was worse. It was a fork in the road. Schumer cleared his throat. Well, as I've said many times, policymaking is complex. In hindsight, Caroline raised her hand slightly. Not dismissive, just precise. Yes or no, she said. That was when the tension sharpened. Schumer smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. I don't accept the premise. Caroline leaned in. You accepted the votes that landed harder than any raised voice could have. You accepted them when it was politically convenient, she continued. You accepted the applause. You accepted the headlines. And now that the consequences are visible, you're asking the public to believe you had no idea. She flipped to another page. Here's your quote from the week before the vote. You said, and I'm quoting, we know exactly how this will be implemented. She looked up. Those are your words. The cameras caught Schumer blinking just once too slowly. So when you go on television now, Caroline added, and say no one could have predicted this, you're not just misleading people. You're contradicting yourself. Schumer finally leaned into the microphone, his tone firmer. I think what the American people want is solutions, not finger pointing. Karoline nodded. I agree. Then she paused. That's why accountability matters. The room went quiet again. You don't get solutions without honesty, she said. And honesty starts with admitting when you knew something would happen and let it happen anyway. Schumer exhaled through his nose, clearly irritated. He tried to pivot, referencing past administrations, shared responsibility, broader contexts. Karoline didn't chase him. She simply waited until he finished. You're doing it again. He looked up sharply. Talking without answering, she continued. So let's reset. She slid one final document forward. This memo was sent to your office months before the vote, she said. It outlines the exact outcomes you now claim were unforeseeable. She tapped the page. Did you read it? The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was damning. Schumer didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the stack of papers in front of him, buying time the way seasoned politicians always do. Small movements meant to create the illusion of control. Karoline watched him closely, not interrupting, not pressing. She knew something most people in the room didn't. When someone avoids a simple question, the damage is already done. Look, Schumer finally said, his voice measured. I receive hundreds of memos. Staff reviews them. We rely on experts. Karoline nodded once. That's not what I asked. A few heads in the audience lifted. Reporters stopped typing. I didn't ask who else read it, she said. I asked whether you did. Schumer's jaw tightened. As I said, policymaking is a team effort. Karoline leaned forward slightly, deliberate but not aggressive. And leadership, she said, is personal. She turned another page slower this time, letting the moment breathe. This memo, she continued, was flagged as urgent. Your name is on the distribution line. And 2 days later, you gave a speech assuring the public there were safeguards in place. She looked directly at him. So again, did you read it? Or did you ignore it? The room was silent enough to hear the faint buzz of the lights overhead. Schumer gave a small shrug. I don't recall every document from years ago. Karoline didn't smile. That's interesting, she said. Because you recall defending the outcome. She lifted her phone, turning the screen slightly so the cameras could catch it. This is your interview from last month, she said. You said, and I'm quoting, I stand by that decision. She paused. You can't stand by a decision you didn't understand. That landed. Schumer opened his mouth, then closed it again. His staffer leaned in to whisper something, but he waved them off. Karoline continued, her tone steady, but sharper now. This isn't about memory lapses, she said. It's about responsibility. When things worked, you claimed ownership. When they failed, you claimed confusion. She spread her hands slightly. You don't get both. A ripple moved through the room. Not applause, not noise recognition. Schumer tried a different angle. If we're going to talk about responsibility, we should talk about previous administrations. Karoline shook her head. Deflection doesn't erase fingerprints. She flipped to the last page in her stack. This vote passed by a narrow margin, she said. Your support mattered, and so did your assurances. She leaned back, giving him space, but not relief. So, here's what the public deserves to know, she said. When the warnings came in, when the risks were spelled out, when people begged you to slow down, were you wrong or were you dishonest? Schumer stared back at her. No smile left this time. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked boxed in and everyone watching knew it. Schumer finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the way someone does when they realize the room is no longer theirs. The confidence he'd walked in with had thinned into something closer to irritation. Not anger yet, but the calm practiced ease was gone. Let's be clear, he said, tightening his tone. No one here is denying responsibility, but it's misleading to suggest that a single vote or a single memo. Karoline raised her eyebrows slightly. She didn't interrupt this time. She let him speak. Schumer continued, warming to his own rhythm. He spoke about complexity, about evolving circumstances, about how policies often take turns no one can fully predict. It was a familiar speech, one he delivered dozens of times, refined over years. When he finally paused, Karoline didn't rush in. She waited. Then she said, You're right about one thing. That caught him off guard. He looked up. Policies are complex, she said. And governing is hard. That's exactly why people expect honesty from those in charge. She slid another document forward, not toward him, but toward the cameras. This, she said, is your press release from the day after the vote. She read a single line aloud slowly, carefully. This legislation includes strong safeguards and clear limits. She looked back at him. Those weren't guesses. Those were promises. Schumer shifted again. At the time, based on the information we had, Karoline cut in gently. You had this information, she said, tapping the memo she'd already referenced. And this briefing, she added, pulling another page. And this expert testimony, she stacked them neatly, one on top of the other. You weren't uninformed. You were confident, she said. The word hung in the air. And confidence, she continued, comes with ownership. Schumer's voice hardened. So what's your point? That no one in government should ever adapt when things change? Karoline shook her head. My point is that adaptation starts with truth. She leaned forward, eyes locked on him. You didn't tell people you were wrong, she said. You told them you were surprised. A few reporters exchanged glances. Pens stopped moving. There's a difference, Karoline added. One is leadership, the other is avoidance. Schumer looked down at his notes, then back up, clearly weighing his next move. You're framing this as a moral failure, he said. I reject that. Karoline nodded once. You can reject it, but the record doesn't. She let that land before continuing. Every time the consequences surfaced, she said, you had a chance to level with the public. And every time, you chose to shift blame to agencies, to circumstances, to unexpected outcomes. Her voice sharpened slightly. At some point, that stops being an explanation and starts being a strategy. The room felt tighter, heavier. Karoline straightened the papers in front of her, then looked up. So let's stop pretending this is confusion, she said. Because confusion doesn't follow a pattern. Schumer didn't respond. And in that silence, it became clear. Deflection wasn't working anymore. Karoline didn't press immediately. She knew that once deflection failed, silence did the work for her. Schumer sat still, hands folded, his expression carefully neutral, but the room no longer read it as confidence. It read it as calculation. You keep calling this complexity, Karoline said at last. But complexity doesn't repeat itself this cleanly. She lifted a fresh sheet, her tone calm, almost instructional. This isn't one vote, she continued. It's a sequence. The same assurances, the same warnings, the same outcome, and then the same response. No one could have seen this coming. She looked up. That's not coincidence. Schumer shifted again. You're oversimplifying the process. Legislating isn't linear, Karoline nodded. But accountability is. She slid the paper back into the stack. When the first warning came, you dismissed it as fear-mongering, she said. When the second came, you called it partisan. When the third came, you said adjustments would fix it. Her voice remained steady. But each sentence tightened the frame, and when the consequences became undeniable, she added, you said the system failed you. She paused. Not once, Karoline said. Did you say I was wrong? Schumer leaned forward, irritation breaking through. So what? Are you saying no one should ever defend a policy they believe in? Karoline met his gaze. I'm saying belief doesn't cancel responsibility. That line landed harder than expected. A few people in the room shifted, sensing the turn. You didn't just believe in it, she continued. You sold it. You reassured the public. You dismissed critics. And now you want distance from the damage. She gestured toward the documents again. That's the double game, Karoline said. Full ownership when it passes, strategic amnesia when it fails. Schumer opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He closed it again, clearly aware that anything he said now would only feed the point she was making. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She leaned back slightly. Here's why this matters. The room focused again. People don't lose trust because policies fail, she said. They lose trust when leaders pretend they had no hand in the failure. She held his gaze. And right now, she added, that's exactly what you're doing. Schumer exhaled, fingers tightening together. Karoline finished calmly. This isn't about scoring points, she said. It's about telling the truth while the record is still visible. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Schumer finally broke it, but the shift in his tone was impossible to miss. The smooth Senate floor cadence was gone. What replaced it was defensive, carefully measured, but strained. You're acting like this was some kind of secret operation, he said. Everything we did was public, transparent. Karoline didn't react immediately. She simply looked at him, then nodded once. You're right, she said. It was public, She reached forward again, pulling a thin stack from the center of the table. That's why this is so clear. She began reading. Not dramatically, not loudly, just plainly. These are your public statements over the last 2 years, she said. Same claim, same framing, same denial of foresight. She looked up. Transparency doesn't help if the message itself isn't honest. Schumer leaned back, frustration now visible. You're cherry-picking moments. Karoline shook her head. I'm tracking consistency. She set the papers down. When something goes right, you frame it as proof of leadership. When it goes wrong, you frame it as unforeseen chaos. Her voice tightened slightly. That's not leadership, she continued. That's insulation. A few quiet reactions rippled through the room. Subtle nods, raised eyebrows. Nothing loud, but enough. Schumer tried to regain ground. What you're doing is political theater. Karoline didn't flinch. If this were theater, she said, leaning forward again, you'd have a script ready. But what you're struggling with right now, she added, is the record. She let that word sit. The record doesn't argue back, Karoline continued. It doesn't pivot. It doesn't soften language. She tapped the stack once. It just exists. Schumer looked down, then back up, clearly weighing whether to push or retreat. Karoline pressed on. You didn't miscalculate once, she said. You dismissed warnings repeatedly. And every time someone raised concerns, you treated them like obstacles, not signals. She paused. And now, she said, you're asking the public to believe you were blindsided. Schumer's jaw tightened. I won't accept that characterization. Karoline nodded. You don't have to. But the people watching don't need your acceptance. They just need the truth. The room felt different now. Less like a hearing, more like a reckoning. Schumer said nothing. For the first time, silence wasn't protecting him. It was exposing him. Karoline shifted the conversation without raising her voice. That was the part Schumer didn't anticipate. No escalation, no theatrics, just a change in angle that revealed everything he'd been trying to protect. Let's stop talking about intentions, she said. Let's talk about outcomes. She slid one final chart across the table, not toward him, but toward the center, where every camera could see it. These are the measurable results, she continued. Not opinions, not projections. Real-world effects that followed your assurances. Schumer glanced at it briefly, then looked away. Outcomes evolve, he said. They always do. Karoline nodded. They do. She paused. But warnings don't evolve, she added. They either get addressed or ignored. That line hit differently. It reframed everything he'd said so far. You keep asking people to separate your promises from the consequences, Karoline continued. But the public doesn't live in that separation. They live with the results. Schumer leaned forward again, trying to reclaim ground. You're asking for perfection in an imperfect system. Karoline met his gaze. I'm asking for ownership in a system built on trust. She let that sink in before continuing. When leaders make decisions that affect millions, she said, they don't get the luxury of selective memory. A reporter in the back stopped typing. The room was quiet again, focused, attentive. You knew the risks, Karoline said. You acknowledged them privately. You dismissed them publicly. And now you're acting as if no one warned you. She shook her head once. That's the crack in the story. Schumer's expression hardened. I've spent my career fighting for working families, Karoline interrupted, sharper now. And those families are the ones paying for this. That stopped him. You don't get to cite decades of service to avoid a single moment of accountability, she continued. Especially when the paper trail is this clear. She leaned back, giving him space, but signaling that the point had landed. For years, Karoline said. This playbook worked. Delay, redirect, outlast the question. She looked directly at him. But that only works when people aren't paying attention. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was final. Schumer stared forward. No response. Ready. For everyone watching, it was clear. The narrative he'd relied on for years had finally cracked. Schumer finally spoke again, but the rhythm was gone. What came out sounded rehearsed, safe phrases, familiar lines that had worked for years. This is a complex issue, he said. Reducing it to charts and selective quotes doesn't reflect reality. Karoline didn't respond immediately. She let the cameras linger on his words. Let them hang in the air. You're right, she said calmly. Reality is complex. She stepped closer to the table, not aggressively, but deliberately. That's why people trusted you to tell the whole truth, not just the convenient part. Schumer exhaled through his nose. You're implying motives without evidence. Karoline lifted a single page. This is your evidence, she said. Your own words, your own timing. She didn't read it yet. That restraint made the moment sharper. You didn't just make a bad call, she continued. You defended it after the consequences were already clear. A murmur moved through the room. That's not leadership under pressure, Karoline said. That's protecting a narrative. Schumer shifted in his seat. You're oversimplifying policy trade-offs. Karoline shook her head. No, I'm simplifying responsibility. She finally read from the page slowly, clearly not to embarrass him, but to remove all ambiguity. You said there was no risk, she quoted. You said the warnings were exaggerated. You said the concerns were politically motivated. She lowered the paper. None of that was true. The words didn't sound dramatic, they sounded factual. And here's the part you keep avoiding, Karoline added. When the consequences arrived, you didn't correct the record. You doubled down. Schumer opened his mouth, then closed it again. This isn't about winning an argument, Karoline said. It's about whether the public can trust what you say next time. She glanced briefly toward the cameras. Because trust doesn't reset every election cycle. The moderator tried to step in, but Karoline finished her point first. You're asking people to believe you now, she said, eyes back on Schumer, after proving you ignored them when it mattered most. The room felt different, less tense, more settled. The confrontation had moved past debate. This was an assessment. Schumer leaned back, hands clasped, realizing too late that defending himself had only reinforced her point. For the audience watching, it was clear. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about credibility and whether he still had any left. The moderator finally stepped in, sensing the shift. Senator, would you like to respond? Schumer looked up, paused, then nodded slowly. I think the American people understand that governing isn't done in sound bites. Karoline didn't interrupt this time. She waited until he finished, then asked a single question. When did you first know the warnings were accurate? The room froze. Schumer blinked. I don't accept the premise. Karoline held up her hand not to stop him, but to focus the moment. I'm not asking about blame, she said. I'm asking about timing. She leaned forward slightly. Because if you knew early and you spoke late, that's not a mistake. That's a choice. Schumer's jaw tightened. Policy decisions are made with evolving information. Karoline nodded once. Then this should be easy. She slid another document forward but didn't touch it. This shows when your office received the updated briefings, she said. Weeks before your public statements. She let the implication do the work. So, she continued, I'll ask again. When did you know? Schumer looked toward the moderator, then the audience, then back at Karoline. The silence stretched longer than before. That information was preliminary, he finally said. Karoline didn't smile, but her certainty did. A few heads in the room nodded quietly, instinctively. You spoke in absolutes, she said. You dismissed concerns outright, and now you're retroactively calling them preliminary. She straightened, voice steady. That's not how honesty works. Schumer tried to regain footing. You're judging decisions with hindsight. Karoline shook her head. I'm judging statements made after foresight that landed. For years, she said, people have been told they're overreacting until the damage becomes undeniable. She looked directly at him. And every time that happens, the explanation changes but the cost doesn't. The moderator attempted to move on, but Karoline added one final line. You don't lose trust because you're wrong, she said. You lose it because you won't admit when you knew better. Schumer said nothing. The cameras held the shot longer than usual. For everyone watching, it was clear. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a record. The moderator cleared his throat, clearly ready to wrap things up. We're almost out of time. Karoline nodded politely, but she didn't look away from Schumer. Then let me end with this, she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't need to. For years, Karoline continued, you've positioned yourself as the adult in the room, the experienced one, the man who knows how Washington really works. She paused briefly, but experience only matters if it's paired with accountability. Schumer shifted in his seat, folding his hands together. His expression was controlled, but tight, like someone holding a door shut rather than standing confidently behind it. You've said tonight that governing is complex, Karoline continued. You've said decisions evolve, that statements are contextual. She nodded once. All true. But here's what never evolves, the public record. She turned slightly, gesturing to the stack of documents that now sat untouched between them. These aren't opinions. They're not interpretations. They're votes, statements, timelines, your words, your decisions. She looked back at him. And when those don't line up with what you're saying now, that's not nuance. That's contradiction. The room stayed silent. Karoline took a breath, then delivered her final line not as an attack, but as a conclusion. People aren't confused anymore, Senator. They're paying attention. Schumer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whatever response he'd planned clearly didn't fit the moment. The moderator stepped in. That's all the time we have. But the cameras lingered. Karoline gave a small nod, professional, composed, and turned toward the audience. Schumer remained seated. After the segment ended, the reaction was immediate. Clips began circulating within minutes. Timestamps side by side, captions highlighting the moments he didn't answer. Not because Karoline shouted, but because she didn't let the record be ignored. Later that night, commentators would debate tone, intent, and optics. Supporters would cheer, critics would push back. But one thing was undeniable. Karoline Leavitt hadn't tried to win an argument. She'd done something far more uncomfortable. She'd read the script out loud and shown everyone exactly where it stopped making sense.